I'm Johan Roshi Vega, and here we are in a remote session. I'm in Holyoke Media, Warren Court Plaza, Holyoke, Massachusetts, and I want to welcome Mimi Panitch, City Councilor At-large, who is 6 hours away from us in Europe, particularly in Paris, France. Mimi, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us.
No, thank you for making this happen.
So here we are today trying to bring some clarity on the large discussion after the vote that took place on Tuesday, June 16, at the City Council session, particularly related to the ban of data centers in the city of Holyoke. And I'm trying to keep it as contained as that ban in ban for data centers, because there are other elements included into this conversation that are creating some confusion, that are creating some different perspectives on it. And I think it's important, is timely and necessary that we all get the chance to have a more clear view. And sometimes when we are following the city council sessions, because of the process and because the language as well, especially when we are talking about legal language, there are sometimes situations where some words may mean something for the general comprehension of it, but legally they may have a different context. So that is, I feel, the most important reason why we are reaching out to you and having this conversation, so you can give us a little more detail of what exactly means the vote that took place at City Council during the last session.
Okay. Stop me if I'm giving you too much detail, but I think it's worth having a little bit of the backstory on this. Around the middle of last year, probably, I, as well as many other people, were following news about data centers nationwide. And clearly, it's an exciting industry. I was very aware of the High Performance Computing Center in downtown Holyoke, which has been operating for now quite a long time. I think long enough that the technology is not necessarily the same technology as you would see in like an Elon Musk hyperscale center. But some of the issues were discussed and mitigated when that project went in. And meanwhile, it does things like, at one point, the entire structure was modeling the first fraction of a nanosecond of the Big Bang. And that kind of scientific research, I think, is exciting and obviously valuable. So it was doing its thing. I wasn't worried about it, but I did begin to have concerns about Holyoke's potential attractiveness to commercial principal use data centers, and begin to worry about the fact that we had no regulatory regime in place for when they came in. And, you bring a legacy type business to Holyoke, say the new development at Kmart, and we have all kinds of basic systems to make sure that that is done safely, that any traffic impacts are studied in advance, that permits are pulled, that if you need a special permit at any point, we have clear standards for what is allowable and why, and who's going to review it. All of that protects the public. And similarly, before a new drug is introduced on the national level, you have study after study, you have promising things that go down in flames because they turn out to be dangerous at the last minute or because they're not effective. But that regulatory regime is what protects the public. And so I was concerned, and I began just mentioning this to other people in the city. And it turned out that I was not the only person who was fretful about it. So there is a neat provision in Massachusetts zoning law that allows a city to change its zoning ordinances to change the uses that are allowed in various districts. And under the existing rules, as long as nobody has filed to use a property a certain way, you can introduce a resolution to change, or in order to change the zoning. And really, the default permission to use anything in the affected zones in a particular way is no longer guaranteed once you have given notice that that might change. So the obvious thing to do, I felt, was to file a zoning order saying that data centers, and I asked the planning board or planning staff actually, to come up with a definition of data centers that we could use for this, be defined in the zoning ordinance, and then be banned everywhere in the city. And my thought at the time was, we do this, we get the filing into place so nobody can come in and just proceed with something undesirable with no safeguards. And then ideally, we pass it as we did the other night. And that gives us time as a council and as a city to study what we actually want and what we don't want. And as people have pointed out over the past couple of weeks, we do have some data centers operating. And a lot of companies have things that you would think of as data centers. We're sure that Holyoke Hospital has one. We know that ISO New England has one. But because the zoning law protects pre-existing uses, none of those existing uses should be caught by this ban. They can go on doing exactly what they were doing before it passed. New ones, I would hope that, if necessary, we can protect as accessory uses by permission of the buildings commissioner, who does have the power to look at extra uses and say, this is customarily associated with the permitted principal use. So it's an accessory use, so we're fine. I don't know that anything is coming in that would require that, but it is yet another backup for we are protecting the pre-existing uses. But meanwhile, my thought was we use this opportunity to, as quickly as reasonably possible, because it is a difficult, complex subject where technical aspects of it are changing constantly, but give a comprehensive look to the impacts on the community from these things. I think that from public input already, we know that we would not be happy with the kind of hyperscale computing center that requires 12 large diesel generators to keep running. And that's happened in some parts of the country. Developers have come in and plopped down these enormously polluting generators to keep their data centers running. And often in communities that can't protect themselves. It's a real environmental justice issue. But here, there's a lot of what Donald Rumsfeld would have called unknown unknowns. And we need to study it. We need to get it right. But although the ban is not written to expire, the idea always was that once we had the regulations, we replace the ban with the regulations, with the places that we would permit data centers, with all of the oversight that we feel we need to keep the city safe. And at that point, there would no longer be a ban. And the reason that I initially asked for a ban rather than a moratorium is because sometimes the council can move slowly, because it is a complex issue, and because, honestly, we will be going up against, if it becomes adversarial, companies with enormous resources that Holyoke cannot match, and not being rushed, not having a deadline by which we have to do this or we will be wide open without any controls, is an important negotiating position to maintain, I feel. So, we could have gone with a moratorium from the beginning. We could have said, okay, 2 years and that's it. But I don't believe in negotiating against yourself, basically. I think you do you put yourself in the strongest negotiating position. You hope for a good collaborative process with anybody coming in, but you don't assume that will always be the case. So that is why, in my mind, a ban rather than a moratorium. We did, as I think everybody knows, at the last minute write a moratorium version of this. And I think the ban gives us more protection. I'm glad it passed. As I said on Tuesday night, I would have, if it had been the will of the rest of the council, happily signed on to the moratorium. The key thing in my mind is we cannot go into this unprotected. And having this in place protects us. And I think some people worry that replacing the ban with regulation is going to be a hard lift for the council because it will require 9 votes. But if we have good regulation, I really don't see the problem. Everybody will be on board at that point, including, I hope, the people who are really afraid of anything that you call a data center, whose positions I do respect, and they were part of a broad coalition, and I would not want to move forward without their full participation and understanding of the issues.
And this is where we begin to have those different points of view related to some words. So ban versus moratorium. And then talking about now with a ban, no data centers are allowed in the city of Holyoke. But what about the one that exists already?
Absolutely. And the High Performance Green Computing Center has been operating for 10 years. It has not, to our knowledge, caused any real problems. But when it came in, and I was not part of the discussions at that point, it was a massive set of negotiations with the universities that are part of the consortium that supports it, with the state, and there are complexities to it. One of the things we discovered in the last days of this process, and I'm sorry that it was not discovered earlier, but the data set, the people running that project didn't come forward in our hearings, so we didn't know it. But among the background agreements was an agreement that would have allowed expansion. And there was some discussion about whether that was part of the pre-existing project. And again, pre-existing non-conforming use is protected under the law. And we initially, after some back and forth with the city solicitor, didn't even mention it in the order because pre-existing was pre-existing, it was protected. What we didn't know was about the agreements that would have allowed for its expansion. And we did have ultimately some discussion with what those provided for. And the conclusion was that we should honor those agreements and treat them as part of the pre-existing use up to that 12 megawatt cutoff point. So that's where that came from. It was basically an acknowledgement that this was part of the existing use. And is that too confusing? Do I have to go back and explain that more clearly?
I think the situation in this case, for what I was looking in terms of reaction, comments, and even requests for clarification, was that the up to 12 megawatts, and then in other reports was mentioned over 12 megawatts, maybe trying to put in context that anything going over that amount of power is what is not going to be allowed. But it's not the same when you see it written, especially without the rest of the whole context that comes with this explanation and this decision from the legal point of view, and how to put it in plain words for someone who is trying to follow but may not have the full comprehension of the process particularly. So it makes clear sense of what exactly are we talking about related to those 12 megawatts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is just part of the existing use as we wrote it. And if you read the language of the order, it's set forth in its own little paragraph, specifically calling out that facility as being permitted up to 12 megawatts, even if it's not at 12 now. But there is that cap now. It is not applicable to any other center coming in. You know, everything else that is new, as opposed to pre-existing, is on hold until we lift this.
So with this particular decision on changing the language and specifying up to 12 megawatts, with which we just discussed, then it comes the other point that was discussed on particularly item 58, where it was proposed to create an ad hoc committee. So that way there could be discussion, research, and figure out the details related to establishing a data center. With this ban, that ad hoc committee is not necessarily going to happen. However, it was mentioned during the discussion by several city councilors that it would be great to have one that not only includes the ones proposed in the original language, but including members of the community, particularly many of who spoke during public comment during the session.
Yeah. That was so great. And we have so many well-informed and people in relevant professions. And yeah, the ad hoc committee, the membership was not meant to be set in stone. It was, obviously we will want somebody from HGA. Obviously we will want somebody from the water department. I think it is obvious that we want at least one person, possibly two, from the planning side of, the planning board, the Office of Planning, as opposed to the Office of Economic Development. They do fundamentally different things. And the planning side, they can keep you out of so much trouble if they are consulted early and often. But yeah, one of the first things everybody noticed was that really one member of the public was insufficient, and I think it got sent to committee rather than passed on the floor so that we could talk about what a good, solid committee would look like. And I think we want health experts. We want people who can actually weigh in on things like, you start digging into the technology and you get things like, okay, this is good because now there are closed-loop technologies that don't use all of this water for cooling. Oh, wait, the closed-loop systems turn out to have problems because there are contaminants that get discharged. And all of this has to be taken into account. It's a very complex, we don't go out and build chips in our backyard. We need to know this stuff, and I think that all of us who are involved in this at all have a hell of a learning curve in front of us. And just things look safe, then they don't look safe. And the other thing is, as I think anybody watching this process go down knows, it was a coalition of people with very different perspectives on this who supported the ban. It wasn't, there are people who want an absolute ban, period, the end. There are people who are mostly concerned with the environmental justice impacts. There are people who look at this as a real business opportunity, but want to make sure that it's done safely. And I think ultimately our interests are all the same. Nobody wants to have cumulative, we permitted this 15 megawatt facility, which many communities would class as a big one, not as a little tiny one. And so, okay, now it's all right because the sky has not fallen for us to permit two more 15 megawatt facilities. How about another one? How about the one after that? And that too is something I think we need to think about. So it is complicated, but in the end, I really think it comes back to the one simple point of this is new. many new things turn out to have hazards that were not expected in the beginning. And now we know that. We have been through many cycles of technology, from asbestos, a real miracle when it came out, and nobody expected to still be paying victims of it 150 years later. Nobody expected that we were going to have to get a forever chemical out of our water supplies somehow after they've already leached in. Nobody, well, some people expected global climate change, but the general public didn't. And I think what we've learned is, trust but verify. You need the verification, and you need to know what it is you need to be looking at. And if this process works, we will know that. If it doesn't, I think we've got a real problem. But I'm really glad that the city decided to do it.
And the outcome of this process and this discussion, both in City Council and the committee as well, brought up a vote of 9 against 4 in favor of banning data centers in Holyoke. What happens next? What does this mean, even for the ones who see this as a victory from the perspective of people who were opposed to having a data center established in Holyoke the way it was looking to happen? What it would be now, the afterwards of this decision?
Well, the first afterwards is that we wait for the mayor to either sign it or let it go into effect unsigned, or I desperately hope not, send it back. I did speak to the mayor directly right after the June 2nd meeting. And he told me at the time that he was more than willing to accept whatever the city council decided to do about this. So I don't expect him to veto it. But, until he makes a final decision, the possibility is out there.
This is an important update. At the same time of this interview being recorded at Holyoke City Hall, Mayor Joshua Garcia signed into law the changes made and voted by the Holyoke City Council, making official the ban of data centers in Holyoke.
This will be in effect at that point. I think that it's probably in preliminary effect now, since it says it will take effect upon passage. And so everybody is on hold. I think what many people are doing now is looking around for what are the resources we need to move immediately to the regulatory stage. One consequence of having to send it to committee, which we are concerned about, is that we're not going to start that work officially tomorrow. I think we are starting it unofficially already. Everyone is looking for who are the experts, what do we need to know. We have a huge advantage in a way because this took long enough that other communities have developed regulations. Lawyers love models. I love the fact that Mansfield has a beautiful looking regulatory regime that we can study and possibly steal from. There will be other communities that have done it. Many, many, many very sophisticated governments. The New York legislature has worked on it. Other legislatures have worked on it. So, from the legal point of view, I think we've got a lot that we can use to jumpstart it. And I think that will happen. I think from comments that our one known applicant has made to the media that they may want to have some input, and they may have sources to share with us that are useful to us in this process. That's no guarantee that ultimately their project will be approved. It's also no guarantee that it never will. But there was one other developer who briefly showed up for our public hearings on this, a gentleman out of New York who actually had served in his own town's government, who in our public hearings basically said, I would love to move forward tomorrow, but I've been where you are and I understand completely that your job is protecting your community and, we'll be talking. Which is a lovely attitude to see, I have to say. But I think that's what happens next. And I'm sure that everyone who contributed to this decision, and there were a lot of them, is thinking about how to present their interests. The way we're thinking about the ad hoc committee is that it will function as, under the open meeting law. There will be hearings that everyone is welcome to participate in. So everybody will have an opportunity not only to share their viewpoint, but to share any technical information that they feel we should have. And we'll see who's on it, and we'll see where it goes from here. But I'm, at this point, very optimistic. And it just, for all the controversy now, I think that most of the worst of it is pure misunderstanding of what happened. And it's so inspiring to see people come out and talk to the city council the way they did the other night. It's the way small city New England government is designed to work, and it's beautiful. And I like to think that even if my side had lost, I would think it was beautiful.
It definitely shows that community cares and there is action to be taken and more to continue happening. If anything, this is the perfect way to illustrate how important it is community engagement and participation in the process of different things happening in the city, thinking about not only the decisions that happen in a regular session, but the ones that could have an impact for future generations. And this also brings us to the point of the responsibility we all have on keeping information clear and factual, and not to jump into just being the first and saying, I know something about this, I heard of, or I think this is, which is totally fine. I mean, that's the very sense of the First Amendment. But as of service of informing people, informing a collective knowledge, it requires a little more effort, making sure that an opinion doesn't become a non-structured fact that most people will go with just because they may agree with it. But agreement doesn't mean reality in many aspects. And I think this is also a great opportunity for all of us in the community and including the media to be more attentive, more responsible with the way information is handled, and not wanting to be the first, but to be right.
That would be wonderful. There's so many other issues that are every bit this important. There is the community violence problem, and the way, shout out to Councillor Rivera and Councillor Thalheimer and several others of my colleagues for really wanting to get some focus on this. You do it right. It's immensely complicated. And I think one of the hardest things in the world is for people to change their minds when they have new information. It's a great intellectual gift, and you see it only occasionally, naturally. But I think it can be learned. And I think this process is an illustration of the fact that it can be learned. And we have so many of the big ones going on right now. There's the fight over what really should have been simple, which is all of the zoning ordinance changes, which I know communications really upset a lot of people because they didn't understand when the notices first came. And when you actually examine the proposed changes, they're relatively mild. They are like, let's clean this system up before we try to do anything complicated. And we said, I'm in Paris now, and I'm walking these beautiful streets where there are, to be all technical and planning-y about it, zero setbacks. You walk the streets, there are narrow streets and there are walls. But the walls are gorgeous and they allow for a great deal of housing in Holyoke, particularly downtown Holyoke. And this is one of the things that we've been talking about. Not being able to do zero setbacks has had a real impact on what we can rebuild. And one of the things that we are proposing, the mayor has tried to propose, is okay, what happens if we do zero setbacks? Because there are ways in which downtown Holyoke is modeled on an old European city. And can be beautiful, can be incredibly livable. And this is just a first, let's look at the broad picture and clean up a few things to make it easier to see what else we can do. And somehow it's gotten all tied up with, well, we got this notice and it scared us. And it did. They should not have been scared by the notice, and that is bad. But I don't believe that it should stop us considering the actual substance of these orders, which is not scary at all. And, we go one at a time. The planning board hears things until no one has anything left to say. It's just civics, and we don't teach civics anymore. And I'm sure if I were to take up the rest of your day, I could think of 10 more issues like this.
But definitely, this is the perfect opportunity as well to have those conversations, and maybe topic by topic, so that way can be enough time, and especially the flexibility of going into details about certain aspects of some of the discussions in some of these topics that may require that extra clarification or context or additional information that sometimes it happens during sessions at City Council and the committees. But because, once again, the process and the language, it may go a little bit too heavy for many people. And if anything, this is another great chance to even bring more of that opportunity to address specific points of view, specific statements, questions that we are keeping track of the engagement during the coverage of these city council meetings, and of course the interaction with people in the community in our everyday lives. So Mimi, I really want to thank you for making the time, being this far, and still being committed to make time to talk to us about the meaning of this vote of past city council meeting, as well as you being during that meeting pretty much all night up, because that 6 hours difference meant that you were up at least up to 4 a.m.
Yeah, I saw the sun come up here. But it's really worthwhile, and I really appreciate Holyoke Media and you doing this, in part because you will have noticed the other night that the city council president was really trying to keep us on track. We are not supposed to be discussing substantive issues when we get to the full council. We were supposed to have done that earlier and just be voting on them. But at the same time, the public naturally tunes into a full council meeting. And if you don't take the opportunity or have the opportunity to explain things on the council floor, of course people are going to be confused. And I think, unfortunately, both sides are right. It's a dilemma that I don't know how to solve. We can't be there all night, and the public mostly, very few issues are disengaging. But, I suppose to a certain extent, I'm apologizing to the city council president, who has all of my respect, for putting up with the back and forth that I felt at a minimum had to be done. She's right, we shouldn't be doing it there, but what are the other opportunities? And this is one of them, so thank you.
Well, and the invitation, of course, remains open to come back and continue having these conversations in future topics and situations that are part of the work of local government related to things that are important for our community. And seeing now that community is bringing their voices and their opinions with a
Yes.
more strong presence is something that really brings joy and makes to have a real sense of what democracy looks like in our community.
Yeah. It's awesome. It really is.
Well, Mimi Panitch, City Councilor at Large for the City of Holyoke, thank you so much. Keep enjoying Paris, and we will look forward to seeing you back and continue this work.
Yeah. Thank you very much.